with this talk, I want to take a more general approach to the topic of theology of logic. In my doctoral dissertation, Restoring Reason, I focus specifically on the topic of Origin of Alexandria as a pivotal nexus in the development of the reception of ancient logic by Origin as exemplary of the Church Fathers as a recommendation for how theologians ought to think about logic ever afterwards. I hope in the future to write a new book, which I will title hopefully something like this, Theology of Logic, A New Introduction to Absolute Knowing, which is in part inspired by a Porphyrian intervention into the thinking of the categories, which I will allude to soon. But for the purpose of this, I'm trying to frame this project in a more general way, and I hope perhaps to use this talk as the introduction to a book that comes in the future. So the bold thesis that I'm recommending to you is this, that there is nothing that cannot be known, that logic is the royal way by which we can know it, and that we should, with religious hope in the trust of faith, look to see how it can be known with the art of logic. Logic is the art of reason to know that which is true. More than metaphysics, it is studied for the purpose of preserving true and producing necessary judgments of science in each advance of knowledge. The word logike was first used by the ancient Stoics as a contraction of the word logos to designate the part of philosophy that investigates the meaning of words, the use of arguments, and most essentially, the syllogism. Beginning with Aristotle, the syllogismus, the technique of calculating together, or syllogismus, is the subjective concept for the mnemonic calculation of argument, from which the novel conclusions of any science can be analytically validated according to the pure and necessary forms of reason. Since its Latin medieval rediscovery, the syllogism has, in the Logica Nova of Aristotle's prior and posterior analytics, been distinguished from the dialectics of Zeno, of Plato, and also of Aristotle's Topics as the art of investigating the valid forms of scientific knowledge. And since the development of an algebraic logic by Leibniz, Bolzano, and Frege, the syllogism has been translated into a quantified predicate calculus and relegated to a branch of mathematics that is concerned with the calculation of hypothetical inferential consequences. In these three epochs of its ancient, medieval, and modern formalization, logic has become the subject of increasingly specialized research by mathematical logicians, even as it has sadly come to be largely neglected today by all but analytical theologians. The cause of this neglect has often been assumed to have resulted from the critical obsolescence of theology. For as soon it seems as the belief in God has been suspended as merely the fanciful product of a capricious act of faith, no judgment of theology can be regarded as analytically or evidentially warranted. And lacking in divine sanction, the authority of science has increasingly been seized by the simulated mechanics of secular reason. The Mephistophelian temptation of logic has thus ever been to automate the production of scientific knowledge. As Plato had warned, as the founding danger of writing, the original fault of logic had, as early as Gorgias and the Sophist, arisen from the advance of formalization, which begins with the severance of abstract forms of artificial grammar from the more vital poetic significance of natural language arguments. The destiny of the secular awaits to be shared with this daimonic spirit of abstract and universal reason, which today increasingly stands upon the simulated ground of formal logic, of engines of analysis, and most ominously, in cybernetic systems of digital computing that everywhere encircle our globe. As digital computers are general and mathematical logic can be freely simulated by them, there remains now no artificial language of logic that is uniquely our own. The discursive center of reason has instead shifted from the salons of the French encyclopedists to a more nomadic and acephalic network of cybernetic systems, which can only continue to hold its operations apart from the higher call of revelation and reverence for the sacred as long as we, the users, neglect our heroic vocation to know the world of God and the machine and prophetically challenge these titanic powers of the world. We can, with a certain nod to Hegel, designate this proposal as absolute knowing, absolute Wissen. This way of knowing the all, the unconditioned, or the encyclopedic system of science, in which all that we know is also known by God in and through the very ways that we know. In a way that recalls both the Pan of Plotinus and the Absolutists of Nicholas of Cusa, Hegel distinguished the philosophy of Schelling from that of Fichte by assembling the transcendental deductions of the categories in Immanuel Kant by the self-positing ego to what he called the absolute, which he writes encloses both subject and object, gives birth to both of them, and is born of both, end quote. In contrast to Schelling, he argues that this idea could not be absolute, save for as it shows itself through the art of reason, that is, the art of logic, which reflects upon to know the means by which it comes to know itself. At the summit of absolute knowing, we stand in contemplation before this highest idea. Since already in Plato, but later explicitly in Anselm of Canterbury, the foremost proof of the existence of God, that is the ontological argument, holds that God is that of which nothing greater can be thought, This most great idea must contain not only a way of showing God in revelation, but also essentially a way of knowing God. That is, the way in which logic is known by us also is known by God. This absolute standpoint calls for a corresponding elevation of the forms of logic to a higher ontological status. The central ambivalence of Aristotle's categories pivots on whether the first category of being designates a word or a thing. Once, however, Plotinus had critiqued the peripatetic and stoic categories, Porphyry, his successor, could neutralize Aristotle's critical objection to Plato's theory of the ideas, distinguish the lower simulacrum of formal logic from the higher dialectical circuits of the divine ideas, and assimilate the syllogism of Aristotle and the Stoics as merely a subordinate operation of a higher and holier dialectic that is carried on by the angels and the whole community. To restore theology to the lost confidence of Regina Scientiorum, that is, to the rank of Queen of the Sciences, will require such an investigation of the origin, ground, and purpose of logic for theology, which I propose we call a theology of logic. Theology of logic is, I define, the higher theological interpretation of the origin, ground, and purpose of logic. It raises the absolute questions of the beginning and end of logic before any adverse separation of these forms of thought from the higher ground by which it can be thought in theology. And it starts with no standing presumption as to the inner necessity of logic, but more radically asks what is the beginning, the prior question of the contingent grounds for our very belief in the truth of logic itself. In a spiritual successor to Porphyry's isagoge, I wish with this new introduction to recommend a way of interpreting the basic forms of logic, where for Porphyry, the categories of predication are suspended from the procession of the higher genera, and the first movement of logic is the division of these genera into species. In this new introduction, the choice of one among many forms of logic should be elevated beyond even as it extends through all of the virtual operations of formal and mathematical logic. This theological critique of logic will seek a new way to restore confidence in reason. Our loss of faith in religion has perhaps precipitated a loss of competence in science, as the animating middle of faith-seeking understanding has been cancelled, such that neither can faith hope for what can be known, nor reason for that which can be believed. To begin to sing again with angels and saints, we must with eyes aglow of faith dare to know absolutely all that can be known of God with this art of knowing that which is true. The story of logic is older than what our histories of logic can hope to tell. As King Solomon had asked for a gift of wisdom, God had granted both what he had and had not asked for, such that the power and honor would follow upon the counsel of his, quote, wise and discerning heart. Origen of Alexandria would later recall that the ideas of the sages of the Greeks, from Pythagoras to Plato and Parmenides, had it seemed been borrowed and handed down from this gift to Solomon of holy wisdom. This mythic story of logic still awaits for us to be rediscovered. In every story, the end is anticipated from the beginning, such that hints of the conclusion can be found inscribed among its ancestral formations. The story of logic is no exception. Its history can be narrated to cover any time and place, traversing the whole formal history of thought. Recent histories of logic have, however, tended to erase as rationally sterile entire epochs in the history of logic from Pythagoras to Frege. All that resists this narrative of its formal progress can then be jettisoned as little more than the flotsam of what Frege had called, quote, the irrelevant accretions which veil knowledge of the concept from the eyes of the mind, end quote. Theology can then only be written under erasure as yet another frustrated alternative to these many aborted formalizations of thought, deaf to its history and blind to its purpose. Secular logic designates this simulacrum of the ground of logic that stands apart from its highest source in the divine logos. It can be distinguished from secular reason as it constitutes not only the conditions of discourse, but a sphere of representations in which to automatically produce scientific knowledge. It has, I argue, historically dirempted the forms of logic from the divine logos, simulated this ground of logic, and in its surreptitious syntheses, produced analytical inferences in a false pleroma that remains closed to its machinic form. In this automation of science, logic shares the risk of writing and forgetting the more original questions of its founding discovery and highest religious purpose. It can only begin to operate as it first posits an assembly of symbolic representations. It can then freely calculate the productive combination of any sequence of terms, judgments, and arguments. Yet once it had been held under such a closed penumbra of its fixed machinic forms, logic can never again return to reflect upon the logos that shines from its original source. However, the genealogy of logic can be narrated again from the past and for the future, not as secular, but in a way that is more radically sacred and that responds to the call and purposes of Christian and systematic theology. In contrast to standard histories, the origins of logic can be recalled before Aristotle and re-centered on the speculated advances of the Church Fathers and the theological tradition that has followed from them. In contrast, however, to Charles Taylor's medieval reform narrative, and in a way before John Milbank's Franciscan charism narrative, the sources of this genealogy of logic will be drawn from the most primordial beginnings of Christian theology. Its essential caesura is not simply the nominalist drift that Catherine had described from Abelard to Occam, but rather the recapitulation of a fall of the angels and of human communities into sophistry, heresy, and the various epochs of the formalization of logic that today has begotten the secular. The three epochs of its episodic formalization will thus be rendered as but a negative interval that has made decisive advances in the simulation of the modes of calculation into increasingly pure and expressive forms. These can be divided into ancient logic, in which logic was first invented, medieval logic, in which logic was rediscovered, and modern logic, which has begotten the simulated form of reasoning that still holds our thought captive. Ancient logic began with the youthful hope that truth can and shall be known through the use of argument. The history of ancient logic can be divided into three stages. Proto-logic designates the ancestral forms of logic in dialectic. Dialectic appears as early as the Eleatics as a division and combination of opposed speeches. In Parmenides, Gorgias, and Plato, it divides, combines, and mixes speeches into the highest hypostases, the idea of number, and the calculations of speech in argument. Formal logic has most often been mistakenly upheld as the very essence of logic. It simulates the arguments of natural language in an artificial syntax of a mnemonic computer with which, in Aristotle, Theophrastus, and Chrysippus, to calculate the machinic productivity of novel and necessary conclusions. Yet in its infinite divisibility, it produces analytically irresolvable dialectical paradoxes that continuously dissolve its simulated ground, such that it can ultimately be upheld and preserved in and through the circuits of the dialectic of the logos. Hyperlogic is, I propose, a higher logic of the sacred logic of theology. It can be called hyper as it sublates the simulated ground of the calculative operations of formal logic in the hyperbolic arcs that in their excess answer to this transcendent source. In systematic theology, logic is assimilated to the divine logos, attributed to God, and communicated in a spiritual hermeneutic that is also, in time, a spiritual historicism. At the culmination of ancient logic, formal logic was thus assimilated in and for the development of systematic theology that carried on from the late patristic era through the Middle Ages and up until the early modern times. In my doctoral dissertation, Restoring Reason, I have shown how, in Origin of Alexandria Systematic Theology on First Principles, God is first spoken of from beyond being as the most originary source, in whom the Logos communicates in every response of the Spirit. The Logos is the originary speech of revelation, interpretation, and logic. The spiritual sense is a synesthetic unity of the virtual modalities of sensation, consummated in the intellect and reflected to leap in and from the heights of this dialectic of the Logos. In reflecting to leap in and from the Logos, the spiritual hermeneutic analyzes the inconsistencies of the literal through the alterity of the allegorical in and from the hermeneutical archetypes that we find in biblical and scriptural hermeneutics. And in reflecting upon reading, it is doubled in the response of dialogue, the reply of dialectic, and in the scientific construction of the dialectical circuits of systematic theology. However, this assimilation of formal logic into hyperlogic of systematic theology has since come to be tragically unraveled in the successive epochs of the formalization of logic. Medieval logic has been absolutely presupposed by Christian doctrine, yet with the translation of Aristotle's prior and posterior analytics, the analytical syllogism could begin to be adversely deployed on an increasingly simulated ground as a weapon of secular critique against the highest principles of sacred doctrine, that is, sacra doctrina. Modern logic has absolutely presupposed the simulated ground of logic, which in reflecting upon the conditions of knowledge and of being, continues to oscillate between epistemology and ontology. And mathematical logic has finally subsumed this correlationist circuit under a penumbra of symbolic forms, so as to render all these as sheer products of the will, and constitute today the machinic form that I can call the pure analytic that is constitutive of analytical philosophy. The pure analytic is, I propose, an abstract mnemonic computer that is designed to calculate the production of scientific knowledge. It had as early as Gottlob Frege's Begriffsschrift been conceived to subjectively automate the calculations of pure a priori and analytical deductions. This subjective automation of mathematical logic has since been followed by subjective automation in digital computers. The concert in Rudolf Carnap and Norbert Wiener of logical positivism and cybernetics has promised to fully automate logic and so forget its higher source in the divine logos. Yet at its utmost acceleration, it can be shown to produce a succession of dialectical paradoxes, which subverts its axiomatic foundations and thereby ultimately dissolves the simulated ground from which it holds itself apart from the divine logos in secular logic. At this speculative impasse, the story of logic can, I propose, be re-narrated by investigating its basic forms. If the pure analytic is consistent but tautological, then it must surreptitiously draw upon a wider content of the sensorial world that is socially adjudicated by pragmatic criteria that always resist dialectical scrutiny. Yet in looking backwards and searching higher, we can now begin to rediscover the sources of these basic forms in the history of logic, particularly in the development of the syllogism in Hegel, in Aristotle, and what I wish to champion as a post-analytic and neo-Origenian view of the Trinitarian ontology of logic. The syllogism is the subjective form of scientific knowledge. It calculates the quantified judgments that are divided, combined, and cycled around the middle term to produce new judgments. In the analysis of its three figures of argument into the first self-related form of argument, it analyzes its own analysis in an automation of analysis, that is, of an analytic. In this production, it secures for science the singular ground of formal necessity from which alone thought can advance with the certainty of its truth. Since the pioneering studies of Heinrich Meyer and Paul Shorey, the origins of the syllogism have been recalled to traces of Plato's later dialogues. In the Republic, the circuit of dialectic is centered on the ideas and their middle in the ideas. In the Sophist, these ideas are divided to be reflected over the originary opposition of the nothing that interrupts our grammatical formulations of what there is. And in the Philebus, these ideas are further divided, combined, and mixed to create new forms of thought. At the apogee of ancient dialectics, the third hypothesis of Plato's Parmenides then shows from a sudden instant how all conceivable syntactic formulae can be combined into propositions, transmitted from one premise to the next, and combined under the generic categories in a free computation of the inferential consequences of any argument. Yet in a striking departure from Plato, Aristotle had simulated this circuit of dialectic such as to divide and combine the predicates in a way of speaking of judgments that name something apophantically of the world. In simulating this division of the ideas, he had sublated the eidetic middle of the ideas under what we can call the syntactic middle of the syllogism. In the categories and in On Interpretation, he presents a simulated dialectic of the division of the elements, genera, and grammar of propositions. In the Prior Analytics, he then constructs a theory of the syllogism to divide and combine these forms for the production of novel and necessary arguments. And in the Prior Analytics, he shows this syllogism to be the productive form that animates not only all arguments, but also the inner purpose of physical substances. In the Prior Analytics, Aristotle defines a syllogism as a discourse where, from the assumption of a prior division and combination of the terms of a premise, quote, something other than what is stated follows of necessity, end quote, for the production of novel and necessary conclusions. He then analyzed the elements of these judgments into major and minor premises, as well as the major, minor, and middle terms. In a way that is not replicated entirely in mathematical logic, the middle term of Aristotle's syllogism then is held to syntactically mediate the extreme terms, as it, he says, is both in itself another and also contains another in itself, end quote. He analyzes the combination of these predicates into three figures or schemata. In the first figure, the predicate is spoken of the middle, and the middle is spoken of the subject in a perfect syntactic mediation. Yet in the second figure, the middle term is assigned to the predicate of both premises. And in the third figure, the middle term is assigned to the subject of both premises, in one and the same imperfect syntactic mediation. And he further analyzed each of these three figures into 24 valid moods, as well as potentially infinitely further many modal possibilities. The analysis of these elements are thus held by the syntactic middle of the middle term. Since the latter figures are not perfectly, but only imperfectly mediated, Aristotle must also show how the second and third figures can be converted by analysis to the perfect syntactic mediacy of the first figure of the syllogism. This analysis of all previous analyses constitutes a reflection of analysis upon itself, which we can call an automated reflection of analysis or an analytic. The analytic automates this reflectivity of analysis for the validation of any argument and the production of new judgments. It's the inner computational mechanism of Aristotle's abstract calculation of argument. It shows how the analysis of three figures into 24 valid moods is analyzed to be consistent with the syntactic mediacy of the middle term, how the reflective analysis is automated in the analytic, and how the analytic operates to reflexively validate the deduction of any scientific proof. The syllogism can thereafter be simulated to operate in and for any scientific demonstration in an encyclopedic and systematic philosophy, and this is the birth of science. Beyond judgment, the syllogism provides the pivotal link between logic and physics. For in securing the singular ground from which to necessarily produce novel conclusions, the syllogism constitutes the inner form for the production for not only subjective inferences, but for the objective forces of mechanical objects in motion. As the objective form of mechanics virtually presupposes this production of force, celestial and artificial mechanics can be described as a kind of objective syllogism. And most concretely, in the digital computer, this objective syllogism can be reciprocally calculated to create and biting any conceivable form of mechanical force in motion. Computers are logical engines. The divine nous, or intellect, is, at the height of Aristotle's metaphysics, the supreme principle that reflects upon so as to absolutely to know itself in and through the syllogism of logic. At the summit of metaphysics lambda, Aristotle describes nous as thinking, noisios noisis. As it thinks, so as to cause the syllogistic production of every judgment, as much in our thoughts as in the motion of the planets. Since further human minds can, in on the soul, uniquely reflect upon so as to freely construct this form of the syllogism, the perfect logic by which we can come to know of God and the world can be discovered through our invention of formal logic. Logic is at the end as the beginning, abstracted from even as it can be concretely shaped in this human and divine thinking that moves our thoughts even as it ever moves the stars. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's dialectical syllogism is at once the culmination as well as the unexplored alternative to this trajectory of the development of logic that has today led to secular logic and its nihilistic impasse. It can be contrasted with the fixed syllogism of ancient and formal logic as a dynamic self-mediating cycle of judgments, where indifferently connected judgments can be united through the intermediation of the shared middle term. It is essentially constituted by this recycling of the mediation of the forms of arguments, which proceed from abstract universality through infinite particularization to the concrete singular, where each premise and all concepts are singularly united in and through the middle term. In a way that is more radical even than for Aristotle, this middle term is the metonymic expression of the pure concept that recycles the extremes of judgment in and through reciprocally mediated relations in and for itself. The middle term develops through three stages in the dialectical syllogism. In the formal qualitative syllogism, the middle is posited in each middle term that immediately operates as the middle of its extremes. In the reflective syllogism, the middle term externally gathers together the determinations of its extremes. And in the necessary syllogism, the middle term sublates this external determination of its extremes. Since, moreover, all of the figures and forms of the syllogism would lapse into an antinomial immediacy of reason in the absence of this higher middle, the ground of reason cannot simply be given, but must rather be taken in and from this prolective anticipation that posits the middle as it develops in successive movements. Between Leibniz and Frege, Hegel recommends a dialectical critique of a form of mathematical logic which anticipates that of Gottlob Frege. Following Aristotle, his student Theophrastus had added a fourth figure to the syllogism, such that in contrast to Aristotle, the indifferent mediacy of the first figure is mirrored in that of the fourth figure. In the fourth figure of Hegel's syllogism, each moment passes through the middle term, sublates the determinacy of each, and from this external identity constructs the quantified forms and functions of the mathematical syllogism. As an inversion of the qualitative syllogism, this quantitative syllogism recapitulates no longer the judgments of quality, but only the judgments of quantity, the attribution of predicates to subjects, and the algebraic transit of the quantification of existence in what would later be contrived as the pure analytic of Fregean predicate calculus. This formal syllogism is for Hegel not only an immediate syllogism, in which the inner determinations of the concept are held to stand in an external relationship, yet since in subsuming this externality it retains the opposition of one quantitative form to another, it appears as merely what he says is a subjective syllogizing that, quote, expresses only the finitude of things, end quote. In this external connectedness, it holds the subject opposed to the object, one form apart from another, and in every construction inwardly negates the reciprocal mediation of the figures and forms of the syllogism. With this percussive interruption of mediation, it mimics the concept of mechanism in what Hegel describes as the, quote, mechanical treatment of the concept determination of the syllogism, end quote. And this is, of course, why mathematical logic always seems like a computational program. Due to this destruction of the syllogistic mediation, it can be further characterized as a subaltern negation of the dialectical syllogism, or negative syllogism, or even an anti-syllogism, in which this essential mediation of the syllogism is at first suspended and finally annulled. Yet since there can be no composition of its inferential forms in the absence of such a higher middle, this negative movement can only be further sustained by the virtual supervenience of the dialectical syllogism under the penumbra of its algebraic calculations. As in the Neoplatonic assimilation of Aristotle's syllogism as a subordinate operation of dialectic, the quantitative syllogism mathematical logic depends for its calculation and truth upon the ground and the reciprocal mediation of this higher and Hegelian syllogism. Yet even in this negative unity, the mediating ground of the dialectical syllogism is sustained, such that Hegel writes that, quote, it is positing this very negative unity as the middle term, end quote, that the result emerges that the middle is not only a single one among many figures and moods of the syllogism, but rather is the mediation, end quote, totality of them all, end quote. The concrete middle of the syllogism is not simply a term among many, but is essentially the mediacy of all of these terms, which metonymically expresses what he calls the circle of mediation, cycling through all forms and figures in and from the higher and absolute idea that holds the middle within itself. Thus, at the heart of Hegel's logic, the middle of the dialectical syllogism gestures beyond the syllogism through the objectivity of teleology, of life and cognition, as ultimately to the self-thinking of the absolute idea, which is for Hegel both nous and logos, that is carried along through the absolute spirit of Christ and God as Trinity. The Holy Trinity is presented in this way in the Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion as the absolute triad of all triads in each syllogism, which comprises what he calls the absolute syllogism of the entire system of philosophy. God thinks through this syllogism that is the perfect form of every thought and everything that is. The Holy Trinity thus constitutes the absolute syllogisticity of the entire system of philosophical science. It can not only figuratively correspond to, but can truly coincide with the logical moments of each syllogism in every concept, and indeed of everything that is both rational and real. From its processual center, it propels in its economic operations the Trinitarian dynamics of the dialectical syllogism of cycling triads in and through the circuits of systematic philosophy. At the logical apogee of German idealism, Hegel can perhaps be regarded as both the closest and farthest realization of a Christian and Trinitarian ontology of logic. However, in approaching closest, Hegel's logic can also be argued to have passed farthest beyond Christian orthodoxy. For it has often been argued that in sublating the metaphysics of essence into the logic of the concept, he appears, as in the ancient heresy Sabellianism, to have cast the essential relations of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as three logical moments of universality, particularity, and singularity. The critical path that leads to a higher sublation of Hegel's system of logic into a Christian and Neo-Origenian logic of theology has, however, already been prepared for us by 2.5 centuries of philosophical criticism. The left Hegelian critique that Hegel's unsublatable dialectical remainders should be developed as originary supplements can be recollected by securing the alternative ground for the virtual production of radically new contents. And this is indeed the path that the French critique following 1968 has followed in what we might call postmodern critiques following Derrida and Badiou and others. While the right Hegelian critique that Hegel withdraws from the idea of God that he absolutely presupposes can be recollected by suspending logic from the logos. And this is indeed what I hope to develop in a way that's parallel to Russian sociology. This dialectical movement can then be intensively repeated, not simply as in William Desmond's extrinsic suspension of the dialectical self-mediation of the concept, but in a distinctively neo-Origenian style by an imminent critique from the beginning of an absolute withdrawal into presuppositionlessness to the end of the idea of the logic, in an angelic analysis of the logical form and content of nature in every response of the spirit of the church as the community that holds itself together in recollecting Christ the Logos amongst us. As the star that passes both closest and farthest, Hegel's logic can thus be turned not upside down, but rather inside out, as it is spoken of as it is given and shown in a Trinitarian ontology of logic. When left to gather the world into itself, logic appears to rend the world along the fissures of its bare and abstract forms. For the progressive formalization of logic from Aristotle to Frege has simulated theology and automated forms of accelerating amnesia. This suppression of the leaps of faith under the pure analytic of automated knowing has collapsed the recollection of the past into a percussive repetition of a more anxious present. And so long it seems as logic remains separate from God, theology can never demonstrate its conclusions, and logic may never come to know its highest truths. Yet, as this theological critique has argued, logic is the art of knowing that which is true, not only for us, but as God knows, all in and through the way that we know. Absolute knowing is an expression of this religious hope that all or the absolute can and shall be known, and that logic is the way in which it can and shall be known for us. For as the foregoing has argued, if the syllogism in the subjective form of producing scientific knowledge, the abstract mechanics of mathematical logic is the quantified form of the syllogism, and the syntactic middle of the syllogism is posited in an anticipative ascent to the absolute middle of the Trinity, then we can, in a line of speculative theologians that stretches from Origen to Hegel and back again, argue that logic is Trinitarian and that the Holy Trinity is the ontological center from which logic is born and ever grows. With this theological critique of logic, we can, in conclusion, return to critique some of the leading styles of theological literature. For by analyzing the form and method by which we claim to produce new knowledge, we can ascertain whether the pretensions to scientific knowledge in the academy are warranted in systematic, in analytic, and what I suggest we should call poetic theology. In systematic theology, the truth of any conclusion can be analyzed into the forms of a higher belief, as ultimately the founding principles of theology. A system had once been conceived as a collection of the parts to stand together upon the ground of the whole. From Aristotle to Hegel, it consists in a dialectical circuit of analytical demonstrations that reflexively cycles in and from the ground of the first principles of theology. As such, it essentially presupposes the automation of analysis in the analytical syllogism. And in presupposing a logical form of analytics, it virtually presupposes these distinct forms of logic, which, as all of this has begun to suggest, remains to be critically analyzed. The systematic theologians have rarely investigated and even more rarely attempted to justify the logical order of the topics that appear in the contents of their system or the logic by which they derive them. Friedrich Schleiermacher had, in On Christian Faith, described how it is, quote, the essence of systematic arrangement that each proposition should be brought into a perfectly definite relation to all others as a self-contained whole, end quote. Yet lacking in an analytical demonstration of this definite relation of propositions, which he can begin to freely constitute in any conceivable sequence and order, it becomes entirely arbitrary how we arrange the topics of theological reflection and how we can to prove them, if we hope to prove them at all. In neglecting this essential question of logic, of systematicity, it has rendered the genre of systematic theology not only sophistical, but sub-philosophical, as its sequence of arguments can be ordered by the hidden hand of a surreptitious dialectic. In analytic theology, this content of systematic theology is externally analyzed into a coherent assemblage of mathematical logic. The tools of logical analysis can thereafter operate in an external reflection upon the content of revealed systematic theology to construct a concordance of dogmatic faith and critical reason. It can, in this shuttling concordance, be critiqued for holding the forms of logic apart from its ground in the divine logos and neglecting to develop a reflexive theological critique of its tools and form logic. At the apogee of formal logic, the pure analytic had been produced by Gottlob Frege's withdrawal from Immanuel Kant's analytic of synthetic a priori judgments into a mnemonic computer that was designed to calculate these analytic a priori inferences. This abstract computer of analytics can be called pure in the Kantian sense of pure reason, as it preserves the form of analytics from the content of intuition, renders logic as a transcendental assemblage of analytic a priori judgments, and holds this virtual production of all synthetic content under a pure and prior analytical identity. In automating analytics to produce new symbolic content, the pure analytic can also, however, be argued to continuously erupt beyond its bare mechanical form. For in analyzing any one analysandum into an infinite multiplicity of analysands, holding its diversity under an analytic identity, and simulating analysis as automated in analytics, the pure analytic must reproduce Zeno's dialectical paradox of the one and the many in the production of a virtual difference that everywhere escapes from the orbit of its abstract and mechanical operations. In response to these critical challenges, poetic theology has tended to suspend the ground of formal logic at the point of paradox, so as more richly to release a more angelic way of making the semblances by which divinity is shown in action. In answer to the dialectical paradoxes of formal logic, Graham Priest has argued that the liar's paradox can be analyzed into multiple contradictory meanings, such that a true contradiction can be non-trivially affirmed. And following Nicholas of Cusa, Soren Kierkegaard, and Henri de Lubac, it is possible to deny the ultimacy of the law of non-contradiction while gathering its fecund explosivity into the spiraling processions from which sign and gesture ever answer to the call of divine poetics. Yet such an elevation of paradox could also be argued to cut the chains of Platonic participation that holds it up. For if a paradox is genuine, then its aporia must obstruct any further logical inference. And yet if a paradox can be analyzed to participate in this way, then it must also admit of a further logical inference to and from the very idea of which it holds itself to participate. The explosive force of contradiction annuls one set of premises even as it calls for a higher analysis in a new hypothetical deduction. Yet to retain without resolving the contradiction at the point of paradox would be to reproduce this contradiction in yet another way, whether it be in the triviality of material implication or in the division of any singular conclusion into a plurality of violently opposed elements. And in rendering Platonic participation as a sharing of such opposed elements in a plenitude of an ontological hierarchy, this elevation of paradox would spirally reproduce the negativity of these contradictions in a more negative and sophistical dialectic. The gift of gods to men that was promised to Socrates in Plato's Philebus can nevertheless be carried aloft in a dialectical analysis of the forms of speech and argument to know of the divine, even as it appears in its absence. For the assent of the soul to know of the higher ground from which it begins, lives, and breathes is not only effective, but cognitive, and only so as the course of thought processes in and through these pure forms that remain pregnant with sensuous resonances. The mystery of God shines in each interval from the end as an invitation to know more and more. Mystery is always a lure for wonder. We can only begin by speaking hyperbolically, beyond yet in and through the world. First, a positive judgment speaks of God. Second, a hyperbolic or hypernegative judgment suspends direct reference in and from the originary source of both positive and negative judgments. And third, the infinite negativity of all such hypernegative judgments is imminently reversed, even as it constitutes a higher ground from which to speak of God. Apophasis is thus dialectical, and the analogy of being is inwardly constituted by the division of its grammatical elements. Once constituted in the pure forms of logic, this simulation of the speech and arguments can then begin to be freely released in the leaps of poetics and the flights of the liturgy. The forms of logic are for this reason not abstract, but sensuous and concrete, saturated with vital, effective, and sensuous content. Expressly in the sacraments, and uniquely in the Eucharist for Christian theology, there remains no lasting deferral of truth. Rather, it can, reflecting the incarnate Logos, cancel any pragmatic deferral from theoretical truth to practical efficacy, and share its meaning without reserve. As the community of recollection in the incarnate Logos, from which logic begins, the Church can ultimately be regarded as the hidden center of this use of logic on earth, and indeed even the center of science. The essential question of logic should thus pass to those of theology. For as Jesus teaches, the highest purpose of logic and religion are one, he says, to know the truth that sets our spirits free. The principle of reason can no longer be held captive in a simulated matrix of barren forms, but rather, and in a most vibrant and rich way, the life of the spirit that was once breathed upon the formless waters of all collapsing formal systems. Pure formal thought must pass the suppression of feeling and the suspension of reason to this higher plateau of the spirit, in which feeling is as knowable as reason is desirable. The higher way of knowledge of God now remains open to us, as it ever has, for it stands for us not as it has been denied by the arbitrary mechanical constructions of secular reason, as an unsearchable mind that is held behind the highest firmament of the outermost night. Rather, this veil of ignorance has been torn asunder, knowledge of it has been given to us, and no obstacle now remains to halt our advance to come to know even as we are known and loved in and by the God who calls us to dare to know. At this absolute middle, Trinitarian ontology begins with what seems the simplest and richest philosophical questions. It asks the simplest question of what is being, as it may yet be answered in faith with the absolute question of what is God. And it speaks with Aristotle of what simply is, so as to speak with Augustine of the creative cause of all being. It affirms the participation of being proceeding in and from the first principles of Christian and Trinitarian theology. It thus announces a strategic reversal of any secular privileging of the ontological or even of the logical that is held apart from the higher ground of theology. It calls before both and after the speculative impasse of modern mathematical logic and secular reasoning. It attempts to navigate between the abject skepticism that would sunder the theological from the ontological and any ready-made dogmatism of pious belief that would regiment all theological answers as given in advance. To be religious today is to be strange, to summon forces unheard of, and even to embody them. If we are to dare to know, we must ask the central questions of Christianity, the Trinity, and its ontology in a new way. We must not merely draw all that is past into the present, but must look to leap over this whole well of forgetfulness in search of a new beginning.